Hi, my name's Mark Ellis, and welcome to this short presentation about the making of life after Victoria. And I know that some people who will be viewing this will be more interested in the kind of process that we go through and the thinking that we do in putting these films together. And others might be more interested from a technical standpoint as to how we actually put them together. And I'm going to try and address both of these things in my presentation today. So there are three key stages to the development process for a film like this. The first one is pre-production, so everything that happens in the planning stage before we ever get a camera out and start filming anything. The second is the shoot itself, and that comes in various forms. And then the final stage is post-production, so what we do with the footage, images, sound effects, etc. once we've collected it all. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these in turn. First of all, in terms of pre-production, well, what are we talking about here? Well, really, we're talking about research and story development. We're talking about the recruitment and the casting of the work. And then the final stage of pre-production is preparation for the interviews themselves, the interviews that form really the backbone of the film. And it's worth me pointing out really that, although I'm responsible overall for the production, it's really a team effort. So I receive lots of help, support and guidance from the project team at the History Group, Barry Franklin, Mick Jeffs, Margaret Rushton, Stella Belitho, and they were involved really at every stage of the process. So let's go through the individual stages of pre-production. So the first is research and story development, and perhaps the most obvious point of all is you've got to choose your topics carefully. We need to be quite specific from the start about what the coverage of the film is going to be about, just in terms of both keep making it interesting for people, but also keeping the process manageable and the final film of an acceptable length. And when we're looking at the topics, there are a number of factors that we tend to bear in mind when we're shortlisting what to include and what not. First of all, obviously, they've got to be facts. They've got to be stories which are of historical significance and of specific relevance to Leamington. They need to be things that have broad appeal. And also, from the point of view of a film, there need to be something which has some kind of dramatic content. Stories that have an element of conflict or challenge or tension in them tend to work best in this kind of format. And also stories that have interesting characters. Having identified the topics, we then go through a process of background research, and this is very much a team effort. Having created our list of topics, we then try and sort of map it out into some sort of order with a process called a content mapping. So we're trying to put it together in some kind of coherent order so it makes sense as a story, with separate sections that link together but also kind of make sense independently. And this is an example of the content map that we developed for Life After Victoria. And then the final stage of research and story development is the creation of what we call a treatment, which is basically a draft version of the story. And this is a good opportunity to get a sense of, does the story work, does the story flow, and to make sure that we've got our facts straight. Okay, the next stage of pre-production is recruitment and casting. And there are various parts to that. One is the people that we're going to interview, the interviewees. And that is a mix of volunteers from the Leamington History Group, but also it's about finding external experts as well, particularly where we're dealing in areas of coverage that perhaps aren't well addressed by the skills within the Leamington History Group. We're also then looking to recruit and cast some narrators, and Stella was very helpful in putting out a recruitment brief to schools. We like to use young people as narrators. That's part of the kind of the methodology that we've adapted to give a mix of voices within the films. And yeah, that call went out to all local schools, and we had a number of young people who applied for the job. We held auditions, and then our two excellent narrators, Will and Amelie, were chosen from that list. And then the final part of the recruitment and casting is the performers. And we've been very lucky to have access to Alan Gill, who's a professional actor who's been in things like The Crown and ran Teatro Theatre School in Leamington for many years. And he's kind of become the voice of the courier in these films. And he was supplemented on this occasion by the fantastic Sue Moore from the Loft Theatre Company. The final part of pre-production then is preparing for the interviews. And it's really important to prepare for interviews. It's first of all, we only have limited time with people, and there's key information that we need to get out of those interviews. But also it can be quite a daunting process being interviewed with a camera in your face and lights on you. As part of that process, I will always conduct a pre-interview with the people, make sure that I meet them. It's been more difficult in the pandemic, but if we can't meet face-to-face, then we'll do it on Zoom or at least by a phone call. And we'll have a chat about explaining what the process is like, to put them at their ease, and also just to get to know them and get a better understanding of what their sphere of expertise is, so we can ask them the right questions. Which leads in quite nicely to the second part of the interview preparation, which is actually to have a specific questionnaire and discussion guide, which I prepare for every single interviewee. And they get sent that in advance. Here's an example of some of the questions from the one I sent through to Barry. And it just means he knows what to expect when I turn up on the day with my equipment. And also he can prepare any notes or background information that he needs to do, or check any data in advance if necessary. Okay, moving on then to the shoot stage. And the really two main things that we shoot from scratch for these productions. The first, obviously, is the interviews, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then the second is what we call B-roll, which is the other original footage of landmarks around the town, artifacts in the museum, etc., that we use to help illustrate the story. In terms of interviews, well, let's talk a little bit about the setup for these, and this is where we get into some technical detail for people who are interested. So all the interviews and all the other footage is shot on Micro Four Thirds mirrorless cameras. This is a Panasonic Lumix GH5, which is the camera of choice that I use for interviewing. And that is set up with some pretty big lights. This isn't a photo of one of our interviews, but it gives you a pretty good idea of what the setup is like. There's normally a large diffuse light shining in people's faces so that we can see them nice and clearly. And then usually also the audio is recorded via a microphone on a boom arm, like the one you can see over this lady's head. Or occasionally we'll actually fit a lavalier, a tie clip mic onto people instead. But generally we record the audio separately because that's really, really important. Arguably, if you have some images that don't work particularly well, you can always cover those up or find ways to fix them. But if you can't hear what someone's saying, then the footage is basically completely useless. And then, of course, an important part of the process is getting the best out of interviewees. As I've said, it can be quite intimidating, quite intrusive, having a camera and lights shoved in your face. So we go to quite a lot of trouble to put participants at their ease, to make it clear to them that they don't have to get it right first time. There's plenty of opportunity for retakes, and to try and keep it as low-key as possible. Then onto the B-roll. It's partly about illustrating stuff where we don't have interview footage to illustrate it, but it's also about putting that history into context. So illustrating locations which are still there, so people know exactly what we're talking about, and it points people in the right direction if they want to go and see something, or if they want to go and check out an artifact in the museum or whatever. But it's also about creating visual interest, and we want it to look nice, we want it to look impressive, we want it to look clear, and that often involves going out. This footage of the War Memorial, I think I shot about 6 o'clock in the morning. You can't afford to be there when people are walking past with their sandwiches or there's cars driving past. So it sometimes takes a bit of effort to get that. And then also sometimes we're looking at other ways of creating visual interest, finding new angles on things. And although we didn't use it in the most recent film, in Leamington's Victorian legacy, where we were talking about the development of the Mill Gardens and Jefferson Gardens, That involved shooting different kinds of footage, shooting drone footage, for example. And these things all just help add a bit of visual spice and a bit of engagement and interest to the films. Then the final stage of the process, but actually the one that probably takes the most time of all, is the post-production. And when we talk about post-production, we're talking about editing, we're talking about adding narration and readings, we're talking about then enhancing the story with images and animation, and then finally adding sound effects and music. So let's start off with editing. And for this process, what I use is a piece of software, what they call non-linear editing software, called Adobe Premiere. And here's a screenshot of kind of what that looks like. So on the bottom left, we've got a collection of where all our media are. That's composed into scenes in the timeline in the center bottom. And then we have scopes in the top left-hand side, which allow us just to check technically whether the footage we've got is working as it should do in terms of brightness, color balance, contrast, etc. And then you'll see in the middle top is our kind of preview of what we're seeing. This is where pretty much the whole assembly process takes place, both in terms of actually telling the story, but also doing some of the technical work that we need to do to get the footage looking and sounding right. So the first stage of editing is fixing any issues in terms of background noise or any lighting issues. Sometimes we can't always record in a perfect environment, particularly if we're going to film in people's homes or offices. So we do sometimes need to use other software. There's a piece of audio software that I use called Logic Pro for sound correction when there are real issues, but on the whole, most of that takes place also within Adobe Premiere. We're obviously then going through the interviews and identifying the best bit. So each interview when it's filmed, probably lasts 30 to 40 minutes, of which we use at most 5 minutes in the final film. So there's a significant process of editing down there. And keeping it short is probably the biggest challenge of all. And in a way, one of the saddest things and most difficult things when you're putting these films together is there's so much detail that we could go into. One of these films, that it lasts 30 minutes, it could easily last an hour and a half. But we need to keep it short to keep the pace moving. And there is an art in doing that, but it's always a little bit of a shame for stuff to end up on the cutting room floor. Once we've got that assembly of the information from the interviews, we're looking to augment that with the narration and the readings. And the narration is actually one of the things that I do last, because I need to know what the interviewees are going to say before we can write the narration to fill the gaps, if you like, and to tie the whole story together. Once that's been scripted, we then get the narrators in to do their recording. And we're really lucky and grateful on this occasion that Number One Mill Street allowed us to use their little podcast studio and equipment in there to record our 2 student narrators. And that was a great experience for them as well as us, and we got some good results out of that. And once we've got that narration and the readings from our professional actors, that's all compiled into a full soundtrack for us to then complete the process of putting pictures to the sound. So we need to find the right sort of imagery to go over the narration, to elucidate the themes, and also obviously to cover any joins that we've had to make in editing people's interviews. And that is actually one of the most challenging tasks of all. I think if we were working for the BBC or Channel 4 and had bottomless pit of cash, we'd just be able to go to image archives and buy lots of footage, buy lots of images. But because we're working on a shoestring budget, we're really looking to source images as cost effectively as possible and ideally for free. And we're extremely lucky in the respect of we obviously have members of the group who are prepared to allow us to use their images. We've also got a great relationship with the Leamington Art Gallery and Museum, who've been very generous in terms of allowing us to use images from their collection, and also the County Record Office, particularly in this most recent film, provided quite a number of the photos that we've used in there. And beyond that, we're looking at public domain sources. Often the most easily available public domain images that are free of charge are actually from outside the UK. So, for example, the footage of the First World War, it's US film. It was shot by American film crews, I think from the National Library of Congress, who've made it available free to use on the internet. And there's a website called Wikimedia Commons, who also is a great repository of public domain images. We can't just grab images from other people's websites or other people's YouTube videos, or or from Google Images and just stick them in without permission. And that's quite a sort of time-consuming process. That's supplemented with original artwork. In terms of some of the maps that we created for the most recent film, and some of Mick's fantastic images that he's drawn for all three films that we've been able to take to illustrate parts of the story and to bring them to life through animation software. So I use a program called Adobe After Effects, which allows us to take the images that Mick creates. So here are a couple of the images of the Emmeline Pankhurst speech at the town hall, as provided originally by Mick. So we're just able to use that software to add motion and to do some focusing effects and just give a general, slightly more sort of interesting impression of what it might have been like to be there when that speech was made. And then the final stage of the post-production process is sound effects and adding sound effects and music. And our main source for that is stock libraries. We, for the most recent production, and indeed for both the other ones, have used a library called Envato Elements. And these kind of represent a bit of an all-you-can-eat buffet of imagery and music and sound effects. YouTube actually also has a repository of sound effects which are free to use. So we've used some of those in the past. But I think all of the ones that we used, all of the music and all of the sound effect in this most recent film, were all licensed as part of a kind of all-you-can-eat buffet subscription to Envato Elements. It takes a bit of wading through to find the right ones, but I think it's generally been quite effective. Sometimes we also supplement that with original compositions and original recordings. And an example of that was in the first film, Birth of a Spa Town, where we needed to have a specific recording of Hail the Conquering Hero Comes, which was the music that was played when the Royal Charter came back from London, and we couldn't find a stock version of that. So we actually recorded an original version using a very talented young musician from Warwick School called Josh Hill.
At a few minutes before 10, signal rockets were fired at a little distance from the town, on which the band instantly struck up the appropriate tune of See the Conquering Hero Comes.
So if you put all of that together and you're successful in doing it, what you end up with is the finished product. And this here is the movie itself. There's our YouTube link to it on the Leamington History Group YouTube channel. Putting these things together, as I said at the start, is a mix of creativity, technical know-how, and also a lot of hard work and a lot of teamwork. And I've been very lucky to have the support of fantastic people within the group. We've also been very lucky to have the support for the most recent film of the Leamington Town Council in terms of community grant to fund that, and a number of individual sponsors who've helped support the earlier films. And that support is incredibly valuable. They wouldn't happen otherwise. So if you do like these films, first of all, please share, because our objective is to get the message out as widely as possible to people. And also, if you want more, please ask for them, because the more we can evidence that there's a demand for us to produce more films of this type, the more we can evidence the fact that the films are getting out to a wide audience and that people are appreciating it, the more likely we are to be able to get support and funding to make future ones. And we'd love to do more. So please do share, please do ask for more, and please do give us your support. Thank you very much. If you want to find out more about my work, you can do so at my website, which is postmastermedia.co.uk. Or if you want to get in touch, you can email me, and the address is mark@postmastermedia.co.uk.